The carriage had barely stopped rolling when the trouble began. Ashcombe Manor rose against the Yorkshire sky like something from an old painting. Grey stone walls, ivy climbing the eastern face, chimneys breathing thin ribbons of smoke into the autumn air. The elm trees lining the long gravel drive had shed half their leaves already, and they crunched beneath the carriage wheels as the vehicle swayed to a halt before the great front doors. Inside the carriage, the Duchess of Ashcombe pressed her gloved fingers together and exhaled slowly. 4 months in London. 4 months of dinner parties, opera boxes, morning calls, and the suffocating performance of being a duchess every single hour of every single day. She was tired in a way that sleep could not fix. What she wanted was the quiet of her own drawing room, a decent pot of tea, and nobody speaking to her until she was ready to be spoken to. The Duke stepped out first, as he always did, and extended his hand to help her down. She took it without looking at him. The household staff had assembled along the entrance hall in 2 neat rows, as was proper. Mrs. Dawson, the housekeeper, stood at the far end with her keys at her hip and her expression arranged into its usual careful welcome. The butler, Mr. Holt, had the door open before the Duke's boot had touched the second step. Everything was exactly as it should be. The Duke moved along the line of servants, saying a word here, a nod there. He had always been decent with the staff, which the Duchess considered either a virtue or a weakness, depending on her mood. She followed behind him, already thinking about that tea, already wondering if her preferred rose-colored armchair had been properly aired. And then the Duke stopped. It was not a gradual slowing. It was the sudden, complete stillness of a man who has seen something that has knocked the breath clean out of him. His hand, which had been reaching forward to accept a folded letter from Mr. Holt, simply froze in midair. The Duchess looked past him. Near the back of the servants' line stood a young woman she did not recognize. She was perhaps 20 years old, slight in build, wearing the plain gray dress and white apron of a housemaid. Her dark hair was pinned beneath her cap. She was looking at the Duke with an expression that mirrored his completely. Wide-eyed, startled, the color draining from her face as though she had seen a ghost. Perhaps she had. "Emma," the Duke said. It came out barely above a whisper, but in the silence of that entrance hall, every person present heard it. The Duchess heard it. It was the way he said it that made something tighten in her chest. Not sharply, the way one addresses a servant, not with the mild surprise of recognizing someone from a market town or a country fair. He said it the way a person says a name they have turned over privately for a very long time. The young maid, Emma, opened her mouth, but produced no sound. Her hands, clasped in front of her apron, had gone rigid. For 3 or 4 seconds, nobody in the entrance hall moved or breathed. Then Emma's hands came apart, and the silver tray she had been holding, a small thing, carrying nothing more than a sealed envelope and a pair of freshly cleaned calling cards, slipped from her fingers and struck the marble floor with a crash that rang off every wall and up the staircase and bounced back down again like a pistol shot. The spell broke. Servants bent to retrieve the scattered items. Mr. Holt cleared his throat. Mrs. Dawson stepped forward with an apology already forming on her lips. But the Duchess was no longer watching any of them. She was watching her husband's face. There was something in it she could not name and did not want to name. Guilt, perhaps, or grief, or something older and more complicated than either.
Whatever it was, it did not belong on his face in the entrance hall of their home, in front of their entire household staff, directed at a girl in a housemaid's apron who had just dropped a tray and was now standing there trembling with her eyes cast to the floor. Something shifted inside the Duchess.
something cold and certain and unreasonable, the way jealousy always is. She spoke before she had decided to speak. "Who is this girl?" Her voice was steady. She was proud of that, at least. Mrs. Dawson answered quickly. "Emma Whitmore, Your Grace. She joined the household staff 6 weeks ago. A capable girl, very 6 weeks." The Duchess repeated the words as though testing their weight. She looked at Emma Whitmore. Emma had raised her eyes now, and they were dark and steady, despite the trembling of her hands, the eyes of someone who has learned to endure being looked at poorly and refuses to flinch under it. Under any other circumstances, the Duchess might have respected that. These were not other circumstances. "Get out of my house." The words fell into the room like stones into still water. Emma blinked. Mrs. Dawson made a sound of quiet distress. The other servants had become statues. "Your Grace," the Duke began. "At once." The Duchess did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "Before sunset, if you please. Mr. Holt will see to it." "Margaret." The Duke stepped toward her, and there was something almost pleading in it, which only made everything worse. "You don't understand. Allow me to explain." "I understand perfectly well." She turned and walked toward the staircase, her skirts sweeping the marble. "I shall be in my rooms. Please ensure that when I come down for supper, this matter has been resolved." She climbed the stairs without looking back. Behind her, she heard nothing. No protest, no movement, only the particular quality of silence that follows something that cannot be taken back. In her rooms, she sat at the edge of her bed, still wearing her traveling cloak and her gloves, and stared at the far wall for a very long time. She told herself she had done nothing wrong. She told herself this several times. It did not help as much as she had hoped. The village of Crest Hollow sat 1.5 miles from the manor gates, close enough to see Ashcombe's chimneys from the high street, but far enough to feel like a different world entirely. It had one church, one blacksmith, a small market square that came alive on Thursdays, and a coaching inn called the Woolpack that smelled of wood smoke and boiled mutton, and had been standing in more or less the same condition since the reign of George II. Emma Whitmore arrived there on foot, just as the last light was leaving the sky. She carried everything she owned in a single cloth bag: 2 spare dresses, her mother's Bible, a small tin of sewing needles, and the folded reference letter from her previous position that had helped her secure the job at Ashcombe Manor in the first place. That letter felt almost cruel to look at now. She tucked the bag beneath the narrow bed in the cheapest room the Woolpack offered, and sat beside the window, watching the road outside go dark. She did not cry. She had cried enough in her life to know it solved very little. What she did instead was think, about the look on the Duke's face when he saw her, about the way he had said her name like it meant something, and about the Duchess standing rigid at the foot of that staircase with ice in her eyes. Emma had worked in enough grand houses to recognize that particular expression. It was the expression of a woman who had made a decision and would not be moved from it, regardless of what the truth turned out to be. Emma ordered a bowl of soup from the innkeeper's wife, ate it slowly, and went to bed. At Ashcombe Manor, supper was served at 8 o'clock precisely. The dining room was long and formal, lit by 2 silver candelabras that threw warm light across the white tablecloth and the untouched china. The Duke and Duchess sat at opposite ends of the table, with the full length of it between them, which on this particular evening felt deliberate rather than ceremonial. The first course came and went in silence. It was the Duchess who spoke first, setting down her wine-glass with a small, careful click. "How do you know her?" The Duke looked up from his plate. He had been moving food around it for 20 minutes without eating much. I was hoping you might allow me to explain before. I am allowing you to explain now, she said. How do you know that girl? He set down his fork. Outside, the wind had picked up across the moors, pressing against the tall dining room windows with a low, persistent sound. Her name is Emma Whitmore, he said. Her father was Thomas Whitmore. He was a working man from Harwick, a village in Northumberland where I spent 2 summers as a boy visiting my uncle's estate. The Duchess waited. When I was 11 years old, the Duke continued, I was traveling with my uncle's groom along a cliff road outside Harwick. The horses were spooked by something, I never knew what, and the carriage went toward the edge. He paused. Thomas Whitmore was passing on foot. He reached the carriage before it went over. He pulled me clear. The candles flickered between them. He was injured in the effort, the Duke said quietly. Severely. He died some weeks later from those injuries. He left behind a wife and a young daughter. He looked at his wife steadily. Emma was 3 years old. The Duchess said nothing for a long moment. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked through the silence. "And you have been searching for them," she said finally. It was not quite a question. "For years. The family had moved by the time I was old enough to make proper inquiries. The trail went cold more than once." He picked up his wine glass, then put it down again without drinking. "Finding Emma in our own household. I cannot explain the shock of it. I reacted poorly. I should have spoken to you privately before saying anything at all." The Duchess looked at the candle flame nearest to her. Something in her chest had loosened very slightly, though she was not prepared to show it. "Why did she come to be employed here?" she asked. "Mrs. Dawson hired her on the strength of her references. There was no arrangement between us. I had no knowledge she was here until this afternoon." He met her eyes across the table. "Margaret, she is the daughter of the man who saved my life. That is all she is." The Duchess picked up her fork again. She took a small, precise bite of her food and chewed it slowly. "You might have said so in the entrance hall," she said. "You did not give me the opportunity." She did not argue with that, because it was perfectly true, and they both knew it. The remainder of supper passed quietly. When the plates were cleared and the candles had burned low, the Duchess rose and said good night in a tone that was neither warm nor entirely cold, and climbed the stairs alone. The Duke remained at the table for some time after she left, staring into the middle distance. Tomorrow, he decided, he would go north. The Duke left Ashcombe Manor before 7 in the morning. He told the Duchess at breakfast, briefly and without ceremony. She was seated at the small table near the window of her sitting room, already dressed, already composed, a cup of tea cooling beside an unopened letter. She listened to him without interrupting, which he had learned over the years meant she was either in full agreement or deeply opposed, and had chosen not to say so yet. "I may be gone several days," he said. "I assumed as much," she replied, and returned to her letter.
His valet, a quietly efficient man named Reeves, who had been in the Duke's service for 11 years, had the travelling carriage ready in the courtyard by 6:30. 2 trunks strapped to the back, a hamper of provisions tucked beneath the seat, and a pair of fresh horses that stamped and breathed white clouds into the cold morning air. The sky above the moors was the particular shade of grey that promised neither rain nor sun, but simply a long, flat day of northern English light stretching all the way to the horizon. They set off northward through Yorkshire at a steady pace. For the first hour, the Duke sat with a map across his knee and said very little. Reeves, who understood the difference between silence that invited conversation and silence that did not, occupied himself with straightening the travelling rug and watching the countryside pass. The road carried them through moorland that rolled in long brown waves on either side,
broken occasionally by a dry stone wall or a lone farmhouse sitting square against the wind. Small market towns appeared and fell away, a cluster of wool merchants' buildings here, a market cross there, the spire of a parish church rising briefly above rooftops before the carriage moved on. At a coaching stop outside a town called Pickering, they changed horses and took a brief meal of bread and cold beef at a low-beamed inn where the fire was enormous and the landlord asked no questions, which the Duke appreciated. By early afternoon, they had crossed into Northumberland. The landscape changed in a way that was difficult to describe, but impossible to miss. The hills grew older-looking somehow, more weathered, as though they had been standing in the wind for so long they had simply stopped resisting it. The villages grew smaller and further apart. The road narrowed. The carriage rocked more heavily over uneven ground, and Reeves reached up more than once to brace himself against the roof strap. The Duke had visited this county only twice since boyhood, both times briefly, and for purposes that had nothing to do with Harwick. Returning now felt strange in a way he had not anticipated. The countryside looked both familiar and foreign at once, the way a face looks when you have known it in youth and encounter it again after many years, recognizable in its broad lines, altered in its details. They reached Harwick as the afternoon light was thinning toward evening. It was a modest place, a main street of stone-fronted buildings, a small church with an old yew in its yard, a farrier, a general shop with a faded painted sign above the door. A handful of people went about their business in the street and glanced at the carriage with the mild curiosity that strangers always attracted in villages this size. The Duke instructed Reeves to inquire at the inn about lodgings for 2 nights. While Reeves saw to the horses and trunks, the Duke walked slowly along the main street in the fading light, his coat collar turned up against the wind. He found what he was looking for without much difficulty. 2 elderly women he approached near the church knew the Whitmore name immediately. The mention of it produced a reaction he had not fully expected, a softening of their expressions. A small, respectful pause before they spoke, the kind of pause people give to a name that carries genuine weight in a community. Thomas Whitmore, they told him, had been a well-regarded man. Steady, reliable, the sort of person a village quietly depends upon without always saying so. His death had been a loss that people here still remembered, which was not something that could be said of every man who had lived and died in Harwick. His wife had passed away some years later, they said, a chest illness that took her through a particularly bitter winter. After that, young Emma had been left alone. She had stayed in the village for a time, taken in odd work wherever she could find it, then eventually moved south to seek employment in larger households. The women spoke of Emma with a kind of fond sadness, the way people speak of someone they watched grow up under difficult circumstances and could do very little to help. The Duke thanked them and walked back toward the inn slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. He had spent years constructing in his mind a picture of Thomas Whitmore's family, whether they were comfortable, whether they had wanted for anything, whether the sacrifice made on a cliff road one autumn afternoon had at least left them reasonably provided for. The picture he was building now looked nothing like that. Emma Whitmore had been left with almost nothing, had asked for nothing, and had quietly gone about building a life on her own terms. That knowledge sat heavily in his chest all through supper and long into the night. The directions to the Whitmore cottage came from the innkeeper over breakfast the following morning. Past the church, left at the old mill track, follow the stone wall for a 1/4 mile until you see the rowan tree. You cannot miss it. The Duke went alone. He had considered bringing Reeves, but decided against it. Whatever he found there felt like something that deserved a degree of privacy, both for his own sake and for the memory of the man he was there to honor. The morning was cold and very still. Frost had settled overnight across the grass and the bare hedgerows, and his boots left dark prints in it as he walked the narrow track away from the village. A crow called somewhere above him and then fell silent. The only other sound was the wind moving through the dry remains of last summer's bracken along the wall.
He found the cottage without difficulty. It sat at the end of a short, overgrown path, a small stone building with a low slate roof and two narrow windows facing the track. The rowan tree the innkeeper had mentioned stood to one side, its branches bare now, a few dried red berries still clinging to the outermost twigs. The garden had gone completely to seed, long dead grass, a collapsed wooden frame that had probably once supported climbing beans, a rusted iron hook beside the door where a lantern would have hung. The door was unlocked. In a village this size, it probably always had been. Inside was dim and smelled of cold stone and damp and something faintly herbal that might have been dried lavender from years ago. Two small rooms, a hearth that had not seen fire for a long time, a wooden table, two chairs, a shelf with 3 cracked cups and a jug still sitting on it, as though someone had simply stepped out and not come back. The smaller room held a narrow bed frame with no mattress, a chest of drawers, and a wooden trunk pushed against the far wall. The Duke stood in the doorway of the smaller room for a moment. Then he crossed to the trunk and knelt before it. The latch was stiff with rust, but gave way after some effort. Inside, wrapped in a length of oilcloth that had kept out most of the damp, were several bundles of paper tied with household string, letters, documents, and 2 small leather journals of the kind working men sometimes kept for accounts or personal notes. He sat on the floor with his back against the bed frame and began to read. The letters were ordinary at first, correspondence with a relative in Durham, a few receipts, a note from the village doctor regarding Mrs. Whitmore's health from several years back. The journals were written in a plain, careful hand, the writing of someone who had not had a great deal of schooling, but had made the most of what he had. Thomas Whitmore recorded practical things mostly: weather, work, small transactions, notes about the cottage and the garden. And then, near the back of the second journal, the Duke found something that made him stop. Several pages had been written in a different manner from the rest, not the brief, practical entries of the earlier sections, but long, careful paragraphs. Dated, deliberate. The writing of a man who had something specific he wanted to set down, and was choosing his words with unusual care. The Duke read them slowly. Thomas Whitmore had written about the afternoon on the cliff road in detail the Duke had never known. He described hearing the horses, seeing the carriage swing toward the edge, and making the decision to run toward it rather than away. What he wrote next was the part that changed everything. He had not simply pulled the boy clear. In the final seconds before the carriage went over the edge, the wheel had caught on a rock and the door had swung open. Thomas had seen the boy pitched forward and had placed himself between the boy and the drop, taking the full force of the impact against the cliff face himself to ensure he landed safely on the road rather than the ravine below. It had been a deliberate act, fully conscious. He had known exactly what he was doing and what it might cost him. But it was the final entry that struck the Duke most deeply. Written weeks later, clearly while Thomas was already ill from his injuries, it was an unfinished letter addressed to the Duke's family. In it, Thomas wrote that he did not consider what he had done a sacrifice. He wrote that he wanted no reward, no recognition, and no obligation placed upon his daughter on his account. He wrote that Emma was to live her life freely and owe nothing to anyone because of him. The letter ended mid-sentence. He had not finished it. He had not sent it. The Duke sat in that cold, dim room for a very long time with the papers in his hands and the frost still on his boots. Outside, the rowan tree moved quietly in the wind. He had come north to repay a debt. He understood now, sitting on the floor of that empty cottage, that Thomas Whitmore had specifically and deliberately tried to prevent him from doing exactly that, which meant the question of what he owed had just become considerably more complicated.
The invitation to the York Assembly Rooms had arrived 3 weeks earlier, before any of this had begun. Under ordinary circumstances, the Duchess would have attended without giving it a second thought. The autumn gathering at York was a fixture of the county social calendar, an evening of cards, conversation, and the particular variety of gossip that flourished among Yorkshire's landowning families like moss on a north-facing wall. She knew everyone who would be there. She had attended every year for the past decade. Declining would have required an explanation, and explanations invited more questions than she was prepared to answer. So she went. Her lady's maid dressed her in deep burgundy silk with cream gloves and the pearl earrings that had belonged to her mother. The carriage was brought round at 7:30. She sat straight-backed the entire journey into York, watching the dark countryside pass beyond the window, and telling herself that an evening among familiar faces was precisely what was needed. Routine restored order. Order restored composure. Composure was everything. The assembly rooms were already full when she arrived. Candlelight poured from every chandelier. The long room hummed with conversation and the movement of evening dress, the dark wool coats of the gentlemen, the bright silks and muslins of the ladies, the occasional flash of jewelry catching the light. A quartet played at the far end, largely ignored. Footmen moved between groups with trays of wine and negus. The Duchess accepted a glass, smiled at the appropriate people, and began to make her way through the room. For perhaps 20 minutes, everything was perfectly normal. Then she noticed it. The particular quality of attention that a room gives to someone it has been discussing before their arrival. Conversations that shifted slightly as she approached.
Smiles that were a fraction too warm, too careful. The kind of looks exchanged between people who have agreed, without words, not to mention something specific. She recognized it immediately because she had seen it directed at other women her entire adult life and had never once imagined it might be directed at her. Lady Fenton reached her first, a sharp-featured woman of 50 with excellent connections and a long memory for social misfortune. "My dear Duchess," she said, taking her hand with both of hers, "how brave of you to come this evening. I do so admire your composure." Brave. Composure. Two words that had no business being said to a woman who had simply attended an assembly she attended every year. "You are very kind," the Duchess replied, and kept her smile in place with the ease of long practice. The evening continued in that vein. She caught fragments of conversation as she moved, a name mentioned and quickly suppressed, a question about the Duke's whereabouts, a remark about the peculiarity of a gentleman traveling north on such short notice. The story, whatever version of it had circulated, had clearly arrived in York ahead of her. She was standing near the card tables when Sir Edmund Carew approached. He was an old man, well past 70, with white whiskers and the slow, deliberate movements of someone who had long since stopped caring what impression he made on anyone. He had been a magistrate in the North Riding for 30 years, and was the kind of figure whose presence at any gathering lent it a certain gravity simply by association. He stopped beside her without preamble. "I knew your husband's uncle," he said, in the manner of someone continuing a conversation rather than beginning one. "Spent 2 summers at Whitmore Hall in Northumberland as a young man. Fine estate." He paused. "I was present the afternoon of the accident on the Cliff Road. Did you know that?" The Duchess turned to look at him properly. "I was not aware," she said carefully. "Terrible business." He shook his head slowly. "The boy was 11 years old. Would have gone straight over the edge if that labourer hadn't thrown himself in the way. Deliberate as anything. I saw it from the road below. The man knew exactly what he was doing." He looked at her steadily. "I have wondered for years whether the family was ever properly acknowledged. It appears your husband has been wondering the same thing." He said it without accusation, simply as a fact, offered plainly. Around them, the nearest conversations had gone quiet in the particular way that meant people were listening while pretending otherwise. The Duchess held his gaze. "Thomas Whitmore," she said. "Thomas Whitmore," Sir Edmund confirmed. "As decent a man as I ever saw in a working life. His daughter is a credit to him, by all accounts." Another pause. "I imagine she must be, to have kept her own counsel this long without seeking anything from anyone." He gave a small nod, as though he had said what he came to say, and moved away toward the card tables with the unhurried pace of a man who had made his point and required nothing further from the exchange. The Duchess stood very still for a moment. The quartet played on. The room moved around her. She thought about Emma Whitmore standing at the back of the servants' line with her hands clasped and her chin level, and the way she had not flinched even as she was being dismissed in front of an entire household. The cold certainty that had felt so righteous 2 weeks ago had gone quietly and completely, leaving something far less comfortable in its place. She set down her wineglass and asked for her carriage to be brought round. She had a great deal to think about on the drive home. Whitby announced itself before it came into view. The smell reached the carriage first, salt and fish and something raw beneath both, the particular sharpness of a working harbor town that had nothing to do with the clean sea air people imagined when they thought of the coast. Then the sound, gulls and the distant knock of timber against timber, and the low, persistent groan of ropes under tension. Then the town itself appeared over the last rise of the road, spilling down both sides of a steep river valley toward the water, with the ruins of the old abbey standing on the east cliff above everything, like the remains of something that had decided long ago to simply outlast whatever came at it. The Duke had the carriage stop at the top of the hill for a moment. He had found her by inquiring at the coaching inn in Harwick before leaving. One of the women he had spoken to near the church had mentioned that Emma had gone to the coast, and the innkeeper's wife had heard Whitby specifically from a carrier who had passed through the village some weeks back. It was the kind of information that only existed in small communities, passed along without much thought between people who saw no reason to withhold it. He had not sent word ahead that he was coming. He was not entirely sure she would have stayed if he had. Emma had found the position at Prospect House through a notice posted in the window of the Whitby post office during her second day in town, when her money was running low enough to make her practical about what she could and could not afford to wait for. Prospect House was a boarding establishment on the West Cliff run by a widow named Mrs. Calvert, a stout, plain-spoken woman of 55 who asked sensible questions at the interview, paid a fair wage, and required no reference beyond the one Emma already carried. The work was harder than Ashcombe Manor in some respects, and easier in others. There were fewer staff, and therefore fewer of the small territorial tensions that gathered in large households like weather systems. The guests were merchants, traveling clergymen, the occasional family come to take the sea air on a physician's recommendation. They wanted clean rooms and regular meals, and to be left largely in peace, which suited Emma very well. She had been there 11 days when the Duke arrived at the front door. Mrs. Calvert came to find her in the linen room, where Emma was working through a pile of pressed sheets with the focused attention she gave to any task that kept her mind occupied. "A gentleman asking for you," Mrs. Calvert said, in a tone that conveyed several questions without actually asking any of them. Emma set down the sheet she was folding. "What sort of gentleman?" Mrs. Calvert described the carriage outside and the quality of the coat, and that was sufficient. Emma took off her apron, smoothed her dress, and went downstairs. He was standing in the narrow entrance hall with his hat in his hands, looking somewhat less composed than a duke probably intended to look. The journey showed on him.
2 days of road dust and coaching-ins and northern weather had taken the formal edge off his appearance in a way that made him seem, unexpectedly, more human. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Your Grace," she replied. There was a brief silence in which both of them were clearly deciding how to begin something that had no obvious starting point. "I have been to Harwick," he said. "I imagined you might," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I found the cottage and the trunk." He paused. "I read your father's journals." Emma said nothing, but something shifted very slightly behind her eyes. He told her about the letter then, the unfinished one, addressed to his family, the one that had never been sent. He told her what her father had written about wanting no reward and no obligation placed upon her. He recounted it carefully, without embellishment, watching her face as he spoke. She listened without interrupting.
When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "He would have said that," she said finally. "That was entirely like him." "I know," the Duke said, "which is why I am not here to offer charity." She looked at him directly then, the first time she had fully met his eyes since the entrance hall at Ashcombe Manor. "Then why are you here?" she asked. "Because owing a debt and choosing how to honor it are two different things," he said. "Your father left instructions I intend to respect. I will not place any obligation on you, and I will not insult you with money offered simply to ease my own conscience." He paused. "But I would like, if you are willing, to tell you properly what he did, not the bare facts of it, all of it, because I believe you deserve to know the full measure of who your father was." Emma stood very still for a moment. Outside, the gulls called above the harbor and the wind pressed against the windows of Prospect House with steady, indifferent force. "I will hear it," she said quietly. Mrs. Calvert, who had positioned herself near the kitchen doorway with the practiced invisibility of a woman who understood when something was none of her business, silently withdrew. The storm came in from the North Sea without much warning. The morning had been overcast but unremarkable, the kind of flat gray Whitby morning that the locals barely noticed and visitors found either atmospheric or oppressive, depending on their temperament. By early afternoon, the clouds had darkened and dropped, and the wind off the water had changed in character from brisk to something with genuine intent behind it. The fishing boats that had gone out before dawn were visible from the west cliff, small, dark shapes making their way back toward the harbor mouth with urgency. By 3 o'clock, the storm had arrived in full. Rain came in hard, diagonal sheets that made the steep streets run like streams. The harbor churned gray-white. The abbey ruins on the east cliff disappeared entirely into cloud and spray. Shutters banged across the town. Somewhere below on the quayside, a stack of fish crates blew over with a series of crashes that carried even above the wind. Emma heard it all from the upper floor of Prospect House, where she was helping Mrs. Calvert's young housemaid secure the window latches on the seaward side. Through the streaming glass, she could see the harbor mouth clearly enough to tell that one of the fishing boats had not made it in ahead of the worst of it. The vessel was visible between the piers, struggling broadside to the swell, the men aboard working the sails with the frantic economy of people trying very hard not to die. She did not deliberate over what to do next. She pulled on her heaviest cloak, told the housemaid to stay inside, and went out. The Duke was still in Whitby. After their conversation in the entrance hall, he had taken a room at the town's principal inn on Church Street, intending to begin the return journey the following morning. When the storm broke, he had gone to the window and watched the harbor with the same concern as everyone else in the town. When he saw figures moving down the cliff steps toward the quayside in the driving rain, he had done what came naturally to him, which was to follow. He found Emma already at the harbor front.
She was helping a fisherman's wife and 3 neighboring women move provisions and fishing gear from a low storage building to higher ground before the storm surge could reach it. The work was heavy and unglamorous: wet rope, salt-stiff canvas, wooden crates that had to be carried at an awkward angle up the slippery cobblestones. Emma worked without complaint, and without any of the hesitation that sometimes afflicted people unused to physical hardship when faced with it suddenly. The Duke took off his coat, handed it to nobody in particular, and picked up one end of a crate. Nobody questioned it.
In a working harbour during a storm, an extra pair of hands was an extra pair of hands, regardless of who they belonged to. They worked alongside the townspeople for the better part of 2 hours. The boat that had been struggling at the harbour mouth eventually made it through, limping in on reduced sail, to a brief, ragged cheer from the quayside that the wind swallowed almost immediately. 2 men from the crew were helped ashore with injuries, one a broken hand, one a cut across the shoulder from a snapped line. Emma helped get them into shelter and found clean linen from somewhere to bind the worse of the 2 wounds, with a competence that suggested she had done similar things before. By the time the worst of the storm had passed and the rain had eased to a cold, steady drizzle, it was nearly dark. Emma and the Duke were standing on the quayside with a small group of fishermen and their families, all of them thoroughly wet, catching their breath in the particular relieved quiet that follows shared danger. Someone produced a flask of something that passed between the group without ceremony. "Your father," the Duke said quietly, when the others had moved a little way off. "Was he a practical man in a crisis?" Emma almost smiled. "He once pulled the neighbour's cow out of a ditch in the middle of February without being asked and without mentioning it to anyone afterward." She paused. "He was entirely practical." "That explains certain things," the Duke said. She looked at him sideways. "You mean the cliff road?" "I mean all of it. The letter as well. A man like that would not have written it for effect. He genuinely wanted no acknowledgement." "No," Emma said. "He would have considered the whole business settled the moment it was over, and found the subsequent attention tiresome." She was quiet for a moment. "He was a good man, in the way that very good men sometimes are, almost irritatingly so." The Duke said nothing for a moment. The harbour water slapped against the stone below them. "I am sorry," he said then, "for what happened at Ashcombe. You deserved none of it." "The Duchess did not know," Emma said, without particular bitterness. "People act badly when they are frightened. I have found that to be fairly universal, regardless of circumstance or station." It was said without malice, but the precision of it hung in the cold air between them for a moment. The Duke looked out at the harbour lights beginning to appear through the drizzle and said nothing. Some things did not require a response. They only required the honesty of being heard. The letter arrived at Prospect House on a Tuesday morning. Emma was in the kitchen helping Mrs. Calvert prepare the breakfast trays when the post came. Mrs. Calvert handed her the envelope with a look that managed to convey both curiosity and restraint in equal measure, which Emma appreciated. She set it on the windowsill and finished what she was doing before opening it. The handwriting on the envelope was precise and unhurried, the kind of hand that had been trained young and maintained carefully. She recognized it as the writing of someone who considered presentation a matter of personal discipline rather than vanity. She opened it at the kitchen table after the trays had gone up. It was not a long letter. The Duchess had not filled the page with elaborate phrasing or lengthy justification. What she had written instead was plain and direct, which surprised Emma more than eloquence would have done. She wrote that she had been wrong, that her conduct on the afternoon of the Duke's return to Ashcombe had been driven by assumptions she had made without evidence and maintained without grace, that she had since learned the full circumstances of Emma's connection to the household, and was aware no apology could properly address the practical consequences of what she had done. The loss of a position, the disruption of a life managed with considerable dignity under difficult conditions. She wrote that she was coming to Whitby. She did not request permission. She stated it as fact, which Emma found oddly more respectful than a request would have been. A request could be declined. A statement treated the matter as already settled between two people of equal standing, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. The letter was signed simply, Margaret, Duchess of Ashcombe. Emma read it twice, set it on the table, and looked out the kitchen window at the harbor for a long moment. Then she went back to work. The Duchess arrived 2 days later in the mid-afternoon. She came in a smaller carriage than the one Emma had seen at Ashcombe, a traveling chaise rather than the full ducal equipage, with only her lady's maid and a single outrider. Emma noticed this and understood it as a deliberate choice. The woman who had dismissed a maid in front of an entire assembled household had arrived in Whitby with the minimum of ceremony possible for someone of her rank. Emma received her in Mrs. Calvert's small front parlor. They sat across from one another with a low table between them and a tea tray that neither of them touched for the first several minutes. The Duchess looked, Emma thought, like a woman who had not been sleeping especially well. Her bearing was as correct as ever, spine straight, hands folded, expression composed. But there were shadows beneath her eyes that powder had not quite concealed, and a careful quality to her stillness that suggested it was being maintained through effort rather than habit. "I will not insult you by explaining myself at length," the Duchess began. "What I did was wrong. The manner in which it was done made it considerably worse." Emma said nothing and let her continue. "I have spent a good deal of time since York examining my own conduct," the Duchess said. "I am not accustomed to finding it wanting. I discover that this does not make the finding any less accurate." She paused. "I was jealous of a girl I had never met, based on a moment I had entirely misread, and I used the authority of my position to cause you real harm. There is no version of that which reflects well on me." It was the most honest thing Emma had ever heard a person of that rank say in her presence, and she had been in service long enough to have heard a great many things. "I accept your apology," Emma said. "Genuinely, not as a formality." Something shifted in the Duchess's expression, a small, careful release. "The Duke has spoken to me about his intentions regarding your father's memory," the Duchess said. "The school, the foundation. I want you to know that I consider them entirely right and proper." She hesitated briefly. "I would also like to ask whether you would consider returning to Ashcombe, not as a housemaid. The Duke and I have discussed a position overseeing the charitable work he intends to establish. It would require someone of intelligence and integrity." She met Emma's eyes. "We believe you are that person." Emma was quiet for a moment. "I would need to think about it," she said. "Of course," the Duchess said. They drank their tea then, and the conversation moved into quieter territory. The storm earlier that week, the character of Whitby, small observations about the view from the window. The ease of it was gradual and genuine rather than performed. Two women finding, without particularly planning to, that they were capable of occupying the same room without difficulty. When the Duchess rose to leave, she paused at the parlor door. "Your father saved something that mattered," she said quietly. "My husband is a good man. I am glad he lived." She said it simply, without decoration. "I thought you should hear that from me specifically." Emma stood in the parlor doorway and watched the traveling chaise move away along the cliff road until it disappeared around the bend. Then she went inside and wrote a letter to the Duke, accepting the position. Winter arrived in Northumberland the way it always did, without apology. By the time the memorial ceremony had been arranged, the hills above Harwick had turned the particular shade of brown that precedes the first proper frost, and the mornings arrived later each day as though the light itself had grown reluctant. The stonemason from Newcastle had finished his work 2 weeks ahead of schedule, which everyone agreed was fortunate given the weather, and the memorial stood now at the edge of the cliff road beneath a canvas covering that snapped and billowed in the wind like something impatient to be seen. Emma had travelled up from Ashcombe 3 days earlier, with Reeves driving the smaller carriage, and a hamper of provisions Mrs. Dawson had pressed upon her with the particular insistence of someone who considers adequate food a moral position. She had visited the cottage on her first morning back. Someone had been in to clean it. She did not ask who had arranged it, but the hearth had been swept, the window glass washed clear, the garden path cleared of the worst of the dead growth. The trunk was where the Duke had left it, its contents carefully replaced, and the oilcloth folded back over them. Emma had sat on the edge of the old bed frame in the small room for a while, with her hands in her lap, not doing anything in particular, just being there in the quiet of the place where she had spent the first years of her life. She had not cried. But it had been a near thing. The ceremony was held on a Thursday morning. The Duke had written personally to everyone he invited, which was not the usual method for a man of his rank, but which, Emma suspected, was deliberate. Personal letters required personal decisions about attendance. They could not be declined by a secretary or forgotten beneath a pile of correspondence. Nearly 40 people came, tenants from the Ashcombe estate who had made the journey north, several families from Harwick itself, the vicar of the local parish, Sir Edmund Carew, who arrived in a hired chaise, looking entirely unsurprised to find himself there, and a small number of the county gentry who had known the Duke long enough to understand that when he took something seriously, it was worth taking seriously. Mrs. Dawson came, which Emma had not expected and was quietly moved by. The 2 elderly women from the churchyard who had spoken to the Duke on his first visit stood near the back of the small gathering in their best coats, watching everything with the attentive satisfaction of people who have waited a long time to see something properly concluded. The Duke spoke first. He stood at the covered memorial with the wind pulling at his coat and spoke without notes, which Emma had not anticipated. He described the afternoon on the cliff road in plain language, not the language of formal address or public ceremony, but the direct, unvarnished account of something that had happened to him personally and had stayed with him ever since. He described Thomas Whitmore as he now understood him, not as a hero in the theatrical sense, but as a man who had seen something that needed doing and had done it without calculation or hesitation. He said that some debts could not be repaid, that the correct response to such a debt was not to abandon the attempt but to find another form for it, something that honored the spirit of the man rather than trying to compensate for what he had given. He said that Emma's father had wanted no obligation placed upon his daughter, and that this wish would be respected absolutely. The foundation and the school bore Thomas Whitmore's name because the county deserved to know it, not because his family owed anything to anyone. When he finished, Sir Edmund Carew stepped forward and seconded everything the Duke had said, with the quiet authority of someone who had been a witness to the original event and had carried that knowledge for decades. His brief words landed with considerable weight.
Then the canvas was removed. The memorial was simple, a flat-faced stone of good Yorkshire granite, roughly cut at the edges in the way Emma had specifically requested, because her father had been a plain man and would have found anything elaborate faintly ridiculous. His name was cut into the face of it, and below it 2 lines from a psalm that his wife had kept written above the kitchen hearth in Harwick for as long as Emma could remember. The gathering was quiet for a moment. Then the vicar led a short prayer, and the thing was done. Afterward, people gathered in small groups along the cliff road, talking quietly in the cold air. Someone had brought a cart with hot cider and bread from the village bakehouse, and this proved, as such things always do, to be exactly the right decision. Emma stood at the edge of the cliff, with the Duke and Duchess on either side of her, looking out over the valley where the road curved below and the river caught what little light the winter sky was offering. She thought about her father walking this same road 30 years ago, a working man going about his day, no particular reason to be a part of anyone else's story, and yet here they all were. "He would have found this entirely excessive," she said. The Duchess made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Undoubtedly." "He would have been here by 6 in the morning," the Duke said, "to make sure the stone was properly set, complained about the mason's work, eaten 3 portions of bread, and gone home before the speeches." Emma smiled. It was the most accurate thing anyone had ever said about her father, and it came from a man who had never met him. The wind moved across the valley below them, bending the long grass in slow waves toward the river. Some things, Emma thought, found their proper place eventually. Not quickly, not without cost, and rarely in the manner anyone had planned, but eventually. She pulled her coat closer against the cold and stood between them in the quiet winter morning, and for the first time in a very long time, felt something settle in her chest that she recognized, after a moment, as peace.